Hi everyone, it's Mike Pohatu here, and today I wanted to give you a bit of a run through on how to set up the file system scanner for Birdsnest Explorer. Now before we get underway, I just thought I'd let you know that there is a link to the file system documentation. If you go to the service statistics screen and you can see your active plugins, if you click on file system, there is a link there to the source repository, which takes you straight to the online documentation. So that's there if you need it for future reference. With that being said, let's jump into how this works in practice. So the first thing you want to do is navigate to your Birdsnest root folder, and you're going to want to go into scanners. Now the file system scanner is this one here, fsscanner.exe, and the config for that would be located in here in the configs directory. Now we're obviously going to have to build that config, but there is an example here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a copy of that and we'll start that from as our base. So by default the fsscanner.exe will look for fsconfig.json. Just to make our lives a bit easier, I will turn on the file name extension so you can see that. But you can also pass in as a command line parameter any other config if you want to create multiple configs for multiple scan jobs. So if we edit that, and we'll run through from top to bottom. Now if you're doing this yourself, obviously this will probably be easier if you use something like a Notepad++ or a Notepad 2, or I think it's called, or Visual Studio Code or something along those lines, because you get all of the color coding, formatting, and help with the .json file format, and it'll just be easier all around. But the actual config file itself is fairly straightforward, so we should be fine here with this in Notepad. So we'll start from top to bottom. The first thing is this credentials section. Now this is actually optional, so when you don't set any credentials to scan a file system, the scanner will use the user context of the logged in user, or if you're using it from scheduled task, from the user that you configure on that scheduled task. And that is the way I would normally recommend that you do this. If you don't want to use that approach, you can create a different set of credentials to use for your scan job, or multiple sets. So you set a username and a password. Main thing to note here is the use of the double slashes because of the JSON file format. If you just put a single slash, you'll get some errors. With that username and password combination, you then assign that set of credentials an ID, and we'll use that ID later on to assign a file system to use that set of credentials. Now if you want to create more than one, you can take this block of code, or this block of JSON I should say, and if we copy and paste that, and if we set a new ID, each ID needs to be unique, and we set whatever credentials we want to inside of there. For this config, I'm not actually going to use this. My user account should have all the permissions it needs to do the scan job. But it also won't hurt to leave these here either. We'll actually quickly jump over this down to the max threads option. Now the file system scanner is multi-threaded to basically speed up the scan job. So this is where you configure how many threads that task is going to be allocated. You might need to do a little bit of fine-tuning to see whether adding more threads introduces more load than you'd like, or if you find that adding more threads doesn't actually give you much of a performance improvement. I usually start from somewhere between 4 to 8 threads and sort of go from there. For a large enterprise data stores, it's usually not an issue throwing 8 threads at a scan job. It barely even notices. But if you've got a file system that is heavily loaded already, then you may find that you may want to lower this to reduce the chance of this introducing an excessive amount of load. As per usual with any production system, I always recommend running this in a test environment or an outside of business hours if you have any concerns on when it comes to things like load. But yes, very important to set that to something reasonable. Let's give this 8. It's usually something that I start with. So now we come back up to this data stores bit. Now this is where you're actually going to do your configuration. Now the main thing to understand from a conceptual point of view is what a data store is when it comes to the file system scanner. Basically a data store is a set of physical disks, and it's important because the set of threads is allocated to the data store. So you essentially what you want to be doing is having a certain number of scanning threads that apply a certain amount of load to a certain set of disks. If you set up your jobs in a way where you have, say, 3 different shared folders on the same set of physical disks, and you set up 3 separate scan jobs, what you may end up with is, 8 threads times 3 scan jobs all hitting the same set of physical disks, and you actually only intended to have 8 threads, and now you've got 24. So just be aware of that. The reason for having the data store at the top layer of the config here is to essentially wrap the threads to a certain set of disks, thereby wrapping the load that it can apply to those disks. So just be aware of that sort of concept when you're going forward. My general rule of thumb and general best practice is to say create one config or one scan job per data store. It keeps things relatively simple. So you have one scan job, one config file, one set of disks, one set of load, versus having single config with multiple data stores, and you may have a bit of a mix and match and it just gets a little bit confusing. So just keep that in mind. So we have, for those of you not familiar with the JSON file format, we have the property name, then a colon, and then the square bracket denotes an array or a list, and then inside of that you have a curly brace which represents an object. So in this case, this piece between the curly braces represents a data store object. And if we wanted to, because this piece is inside a list, we could take this whole piece and paste another one, and so now we have 2 data store objects inside of that list, and then you would have a set of properties for each one. We're just, as I said, one config, one data store, one set of disks makes our life generally a lot easier. So inside of our data store object here, between the curly braces, we have a set of properties. We have the name for the data store. Now I'm going to use a share that I have in my lab called Content Store. So I am going to name my data store Content Store. That is hosted on a server. Now the host that you put here, it's going to try and connect that data store to a host or a server inside of Birdsnest. Now if we come back over here into Birdsnest Explorer itself, that data store is actually physically connected. Actually, we should be fine with a simple search, I think, to a server called Bix01. So let's add that to the view. Now what it's going to do is it's going to look for a device data type of the name that you set in that host. So if you, and it is case sensitive currently. So if we take that name that's in there and we pop it in there, that should connect our data store to our host to say this set of disks is attached to this physical host. If you don't care about that because it's its own SAN or something along those lines, you just give it a name, and you might give it the SAN name, and it will create a new device object for you that is separate from the existing data inside of Birdsnest. But if you've got an Active Directory computer that represents the physical computer the data store is attached to, it may be useful to have that connection showing. And we'll see what that looks like in practice once we run our scan. Now we put in a comment, blah, 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 done. Now, here's where we come to our file systems. Now, data store can have one or more file systems attached to it. For example, you might have multiple shares running on that server. You may be running on that data store that's, say, a SAN, and you have multiple servers with multiple shares. You may just have a single server with multiple shares. Either way, you can have one or more file systems, and again, the file systems property is an array because of the square bracket, and then each item inside of that is an object. So there's one file system object, there's another file system object. We're just going to scan one, so we can remove that. We need to give the file system an ID. I generally like to use the, say for example, if it's in my case, the server name has an alias called content store, and the share name is also called content store. So if I was to visit it via the UNC path, it would be // content store / content store. So I tend to use the server name, or the DNS alias name in this case, and then the share name. It doesn't actually matter what this is as long as it's unique. Now, the credential ID is again optional. If you've created a credential up here, the ID of that credential that you created here can be set here, and then when you scan this file system, it will use those credentials. If you don't set it, then it's going to use the user context of the running executable, basically the user that you logged in with. In my case, we don't need that because the user account has access, so we're going to remove it. The credential ID is not needed. Now here's the path. Again, because we're in a JSON file format, you need to use double slashes instead of single slashes. So that is // content store / content store. Now you could make this obviously any path that you like. You can actually drill down further into the file system if you want to. This is the root of the scan job. So it'll start at that folder and try and scan down. And then comment, this is the content store share. Save. Now to tidy up our config, I am actually just going to get rid of this credentials piece altogether because we don't need it. And that's our config done. Now if I had more file systems on this data store, I would just take a copy of that, add a comma, paste in a new file system. We then update the ID, we update the path and the comment. And what will happen is it will come through, it will scan this file system, and then it will come through and scan this file system. It's fairly straightforward. And that's our config done. Now what we can do is we can just run our file system scanner just for to show you how this would work. What I'm going to do is run this from the command line, and I'm going to show you the command line options. So when you run up the fsscanner.exe, there are a couple of options. You've got the /config option, which is the one we're going to use, and you can pass in the specific config. So what I could potentially do here, content store. So now the fsconfig.json file doesn't exist, so the default file that it's going to look for doesn't exist, but we can pass in this file to load into the scanner. In this way we could have multiple scan jobs and we just create another config, and we can just pass them in as separate config files and run them at different times of the day as and when we need. Now the second option is the batch option. Now when you run a scan, by default it will sit and wait for you at the end. It will give you a little bit of output just to see, this is what the status of the scan was. Press enter to continue. Now obviously you don't want that to happen if you're running this from scheduled task inside of Windows. So if you use the /batch option, what it will do is it will just say scan finished, exiting now, and it will automatically close out at the end. So if you're running this as a batch task, then use the /batch option. So now we're just going to run our scan job and see what happens. Now you'll see here straight away we have our 8 threads all in progress. We have some info at the start, initializing file system scanner. Every time you run the scanner, it will generate its own random scan ID, and it uses this to do things like cleanup later on in the piece. The important things to understand about the IDs that you set earlier in your config. So if we come back over here, when we look at this ID here, what it's going to do at the end of the scan job is going to do a cleanup task. So it's going to look for any item inside of Birdsnest Explorer that's of a type file system folder, and if it has this ID, so content store - content store, but the scan ID is different, it's going to assume that that wasn't found during the most recent scan job, therefore it's no longer current, and therefore it's going to clean it up. So that's why it's important to have unique IDs for each of your file systems, so that you don't have any weird conflicts and cleanup issues there. So here we say it is crawling the content store. Now this was actually a fairly small share in the grand scheme of things. There's not a whole lot of files in it, so it's already finished. And you can see here, every time it's found a permission, it's logged that to the console. So there's obviously one in the contents of the scan, there's permission set at the root, and then there's permission set in all of these folders here. Finished crawling the file system, only took a minute and a half. It's cleaned up, clean finished in this amount of time. Found 5 folders, done. Now if you had multiple file systems, you would get multiples of these sets of information. Usually the listing of folders is obviously a lot longer on a production system, but you can see that it makes note of the folders where there's permissions set, Birdsnest Explorer will only create items in its database for folders where there is a permission set. If the only thing on it is that it has inheritance enabled and no explicit permissions, it won't make record of it at all. It's a way of keeping the amount of data in the view not so cluttered. If it recorded everything, it would just become a jumble and a bit overwhelming. So that's the file system scan job done. Let's actually come in here and see if there's anything interesting. So we come into our reports. So if we say, do we have any deny permissions? No. We do, however, have a couple of folders with inheritance disabled. Now you'd expect that on the root of the share, but not necessarily further down in the share or in the folder structure. Let's see if we have any orphan permissions, and yes we do. So this is actually going to give us the SID objects, or the user objects or group objects, or whatever's been assigned as the permission, as well as the folder objects. So this view might not necessarily tell you exactly what you want to see, but if we open that in the visualizer, we can come in here and we can see that there is a random object here set on as applying a permission to the applications folder. If we have a look at the path to the applications folder and we visit it, let's have a look at the security permissions. And you can see here that we've got an AD object that has obviously been deleted at some point in the past. No idea who it is or what it is necessarily, but we know that an orphaned item exists and we can go and clean it up. Now, if you're lucky enough and Birdsnest Explorer has done an Active Directory scan before this object was actually deleted, it will also tell you what it knew about that object before it was removed from Active Directory. When Birdsnest Explorer does a scan of Active Directory and it finds an object that's been deleted, it doesn't actually delete the object from Birdsnest Explorer. It just goes in and marks it as deleted, as a deleted object rather than say a user object or a group object, so that you can still find out these types of information. But obviously, if the object was already deleted, Birdsnest Explorer is not going to be able to find that, and so you'll just end up with this orphaned object, and it will give you the information it can, which is really just the SID. Again, down here we have this logs folder. So if we come in here, see, made a typo. And you can see here there's two SIDs in here. So again, we've got two permissions there that need to be cleaned up. So that one's really useful as a cleanup task, that particular report. It's fairly common for there to be orphaned SIDs in a lot of production file systems that I've seen over my career. Now there's a couple of ones that probably need special mention. Well, this one in particular, the blocked folders. Now, when we were talking about credentials inside of our config, those are credentials that have enough permissions to traverse the file system and read the permissions of that file system. Now, if the credentials that you've used or the user account that you've used to crawl that file system aren't enough to read the permissions of the folder, in other words, essentially that the permissions are either broken or the inheritance has been disabled and the user account that you're using doesn't have enough rights, it will, in the Birdsnest Explorer database, it will create what's called a blocked folder, or a file system blocked folder. And a blocked folder is literally just the file system scanner was blocked at this particular point. It makes note of it, and then it carries on to the next folder down. So this blocked folders report after you run your first scan is probably one of the first ones you want to have a look at in case there is a permission issue and you're actually missing a bunch of the file system due to permissions that need to be updated to allow that scan job to finish. So that's setting up the file system scanner. Now, as I said, you can create multiple configs to scan multiple data stores, and then you can set up scheduled tasks to run those scan jobs as you see fit. Again, please make sure you follow normal testing processes and don't just run a scan job with 30 threads across a production system in the middle of the day. Things may, no one may notice, but also things may not end well depending on the current state of your environment. So if you have any further questions, please get in touch via the 20road.com website. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.